I remember when I met you for the first time, I think it was in a philosophy society or something like that. You showed up out of absolutely nowhere. And in the philosophy society, as someone who perhaps knows more about a lot of philosophers than I do, and I'm like, what? This kid's like 3-4 years younger than me, and he's like already so developed in his knowledge of philosophy. Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're joined by my good friend Benji to talk about philosophy, his interest in philosophy. Benji is someone I've had the privilege and the pleasure to work with. He's really, really smart. So I thought, all right, since I'm starting this series to talk about different perspectives on philosophy, why not start with my good friend Benji? Benji, how are you today?
I'm doing quite well. How are you?
I'm doing very well. So Benji, perhaps in a few words, how would you describe who you are?
Okay, so I currently live in Hong Kong and go to school there, and I'm in year 9. And so next year I'll be starting my GCSEs, and the subjects I've picked are English language and literature, maths and further maths, the 3 sciences, philosophy and religious studies, music, history, and French.
That's a very interesting kind of topic. But is there by any chance the reason you chose French was to study some of the French existential phenomenologists in their original language?
Yeah, I think partially because some of the English translations of French philosophy are a bit confusing to understand. So I thought maybe it would help if I learned some French to read the text in their original form.
So perhaps we could talk a bit more about your choices.
So I think I chose history because it provides a more empirical way of looking at philosophy, because philosophy is more to do with the theoretical side of things, but then history is like the actualization of philosophical ideas and how different ideas are actualized and used throughout history.
You talk a bit about history and kind of the relationship between history and philosophy. How strong do you think that relationship is? Because of course there almost is a philosophy of history, especially after Hegel and kind of more modern thinkers. But at the same time, there's almost this idea that history is almost completely different to philosophy in the sense that on one hand, history is approaching the world, the empirical framework, or at least the epistemic framework, does seem to be slightly different from a philosophical one.
I guess both philosophy and history require the other, because in history, you might know why certain events, what the events are and when they happen, but then you need philosophy to understand the causes and how to maybe predict future events. And then with philosophy, you also need history to sort of see the effectiveness of certain philosophical ideas applied in real life.
So that's quite an interesting segue into perhaps what kind of fields of history are you into? We know you've made some wonderful lectures for us on postmodernism, on first order logic. It seems to range all the way from phenomenology all the way down to the driest of all logic. So what fields are you interested in philosophy?
I guess I don't have a particular interest in a specific field in philosophy. I just sometimes come across different philosophical ideas and delve deeper into them. But I would say I am most interested in metaphysics because I feel like it sort of underlies all the other philosophical fields.
That's definitely something which is very interesting because, of course, I suppose metaphysics, it's almost impossible to approach any of these different topics without at least presupposing some sense of a metaphysical standpoint, or just having to hold or just kind of attribute certain beliefs and reasons to some metaphysical proposition, either belief in God or whatever it is. There's always that fundamental metaphysical kind of assumption that people have when they are approaching these topics. So perhaps developing on this idea, how have you found philosophy has applied to you or has applied to your life, and kind of how it has helped you or in some sense potentially has kind of been a detriment to your life? How would you say that those two have interacted together?
Well, I think the strength of philosophy in my life is also at the same time the weakness, because philosophy allowed me to maybe think more critically and deeply about things and sort of question assumptions that have been generally assumed to be true. And in some cases, this works in letting me have a clearer vision of what things actually are. But sometimes it just makes me spend too much time overthinking things and hindering any real progress.
That's definitely something which I found in my life as well. It's almost the idea that on one hand, and you shall seek the truth, and the truth shall set you free. It's almost that pursuit of the truth is always very beneficial. But at the same time, trying to pursue the truth, especially to what end, And that perhaps is something we might be discussing towards the end of this video when we're talking about your current projects. But I mean, there's almost this idea that the more you try to pursue it and the levels in which you pursue it can often take it beyond all forms of common sense, or your questioning of the truth goes to a level in which it would be detrimental to your other activities in your life, the practicality of life. What got you into philosophy in the first place? Because I remember when I met you for the first time, I think it was in a philosophy society or something like that. You showed up out of absolutely nowhere. I never knew you before. And in the philosophy society, as someone who perhaps knows more about a lot of philosophers than I do, and I'm like, what? This kid's like 3-4 years younger than me, and he's like already so developed in his knowledge of philosophy. So what got you into philosophy in the first place?
I think it's hard to pinpoint an exact moment, but I think at a young age, everyone's interested in philosophy to an extent, because everyone will have some point thought about the meaning of life or how to deal with certain things in life. But maybe a specific thing that got me into philosophy is this book here. It's called A Little History of Philosophy, and it's quite interesting. It provides a nice overview of different philosophical ideas in a simple way to understand. And I also, after reading this book, I watched a few YouTube videos about different philosophical ideas, and it all got me very interested in the subject.
That's definitely something which is very interesting, because I remember I also read that book a very long time ago, and it was actually a gift from my mother. So I read that book then, and I wouldn't say that actually sparked my interest in philosophy. I kind of threw the book away, and I never really cared about it until a few years later when my first girlfriend broke up with me, and then me and Warren, Benji knows Warren as well. I mean, and then we went on a trip together and we talked philosophy, and that's kind of how I got into philosophy. But I mean, I digress. But I suppose I want to pick on something you said, which is you said everyone is interested in philosophy as a child. My question is twofold. Firstly, can you develop on the idea of how you feel everyone is interested in philosophy? And secondly, is there a similarity between philosophy, I suppose, psychologically, and the creative instinct psychologically?
Okay. So for your first question, I think maybe society makes it such that it is less pragmatic to be philosophical all the time than to be philosophical, because I think, like I said earlier with my personal experiences with philosophy often makes me overthink things and make me question things meaninglessly, and they don't really bear use in the empirical world or in the social world. And so the longer a person lives, the more they find philosophy to be less useful in their life. So they end up stop using it entirely. But then when they're a child, they're naturally curious about the world and they want to know more. And for your second question, I think the philosopher Deleuze defined philosophy as the creation of concepts. Because personally, I think philosophy is less of an academic or analytic discipline, but more of a creative discipline, because philosophers often need to think creatively about things, such as different mythologies and religions and how they often incorporate a sort of artistic element into philosophy.
You definitely touched on a very interesting point, and it's something that I do want to discuss a bit with you, just because on one hand, people view it as this almost mathematical way to formalize what we believe into a set of propositions into true or false values. But then at the same time, almost the more fundamental question in philosophy goes into this sense of phenomenology, or at least this sense of, well, what does being mean in this world? How do you kind of compare those two ideas together? What do you feel are the differences as perhaps the high school student looking at these things? What are the differences? What are the strengths of both of them? And what are the weaknesses of both of them?
Well, I would say continental philosophy certainly developed much earlier than analytic philosophy. And analytic philosophy is mainly mathematical and logical and tries to derive a system of philosophical thought using logical axioms. But continental philosophy more often is directly focused on the empirical world and doesn't use purely rational ideas to explain the empirical world. But then analytic philosophy uses rational ideas to explain the empirical world. And I guess perhaps continental philosophy acknowledges the subjectiveness of its ideas. So a Hegelian will know that their belief in Hegel's system of philosophy is subjective and others may disagree with them, and they don't necessarily hold a certain philosophical school to be absolutely true. But then the analytic system of thought sort of establishes itself as absolutely true and perfectly logical.
How would you say society wrestles with that divide? Because I suppose if we take a step back and we look at what's going on in society, in broader society at least, a lot of issues, I suppose, especially surrounding gender, a lot of them surrounding truth, surrounding political discourse, and we wouldn't get necessarily into what the stances are of these issues, but there almost is this movement away from an analytical perspective to more of a continental perspective. And I'm not saying this as in it's a right move, a correct move, or a wrong move, but it's more so just saying there seems to be a movement away in broader thought, at least amongst the youth, to me, away from this idea that the world can be split into truth or falsity, but it's more based on a subjective understanding of yourself and reality. Would you say that that's something that you do see in high school or something you see in society as a whole?
Yeah, I think I do see that in my personal observations of the world. But then at the same time, the people who constantly crave subjective and new ideas and beliefs are often trying to underpin those ideas with logical ideas and trying to like scientifically explain their subjective ideas, which may be where most of their ideas receive criticism in how the science and their subjective beliefs are incommensurable.
Do you think that then there is a fundamental divide between these two ideas, or is it something which can be synthesized and put next to each other within a theory or a framework?
I guess the synthesis of the objective and the subjective is nearly achieved in the system of Hegelian philosophy with the concept of spirit, where basically Hegel holds a pluralist view of all religions and ideas and belief systems. And he argues that they're all true in a certain way, but they're just true on different levels of truth. So you have a less developed religion, but then a more developed religion. And he argues that throughout the course of world history, all ideas, whether subjective or objective, will eventually all merge together into what he calls the absolute spirit or absolute knowing.
That's definitely something very interesting. And if you want to learn more about Hegel's idea on spirit, then make sure you go check out the video or the lecture that Benji made on the phenomenology of spirit. But let's carry on this and take the step back even further from our discussion about the subjective in society and say, well, how is philosophy applicable to society? How do you think it should be? Should it be reintegrated and presented in an even stronger fashion? Or do you think that the great strength of philosophy is that everyone is doing it while being unwittingly carrying it out? Do you think that's a strength, or do you think that people should actively present philosophy and emphasize its importance in society? Do you think there's that benefit there as well?
I think it really depends because sometimes philosophy should be emphasized and made in a formalized way, but that often also hinders the very nature of philosophy, which is to question everything. And so if you're trying to formalize everything and make it a very well established system, then you are sort of going against the very nature of philosophy as something that should be able to be practiced by everyone in any part of their lives. But then maybe a strength of that is some people are not even aware of the system of philosophy and how to reason philosophically. So by formalizing philosophy, you can allow people to think philosophically and rationally.
Perhaps making it a bit more applicable, or at least making it a bit more specific, how do you think philosophy should be approached or taught to the youth?
Oh, I would say maybe most people don't necessarily have an interest in philosophy because they view it as outdated or irrelevant. But I think maybe an important way to get the youth to get interested in philosophy again is to make them realize that STEM cannot really exist without philosophy because for example, there's the problem with quantum mechanics and general relativity in science right now, and they're trying to make like a unified field theory. But I think the problem with why they cannot achieve the unified field theory or theory of everything yet is because general relativity deals with an objective framework of the world, but then quantum mechanics focuses more on the individual subject and how they observe the world. So it's the distinction between the subjective and the objective. And then if you use the Hegelian system of philosophy with the absolute spirit, then maybe you can achieve that ultimate scientific goal. And also, I guess another distinction between maths and philosophy is that while they both deal with critical and rational thinking, maths is much more formulaic and you follow a clear set of rules or axioms. But in philosophy, you create those rules and question older rules yourself. And so, if philosophy is the creation of those rules, then scientific ideas really can't exist without philosophy.
So I suppose we've touched a bit upon kind of why or how we should make philosophy a bit more attractive to the youth. Was there anything which you could look back in your life to say, well, apart from perhaps reading that book that you were given, would you say, well, perhaps there were some other things which developed my interest beyond that book?
Well, that is a very good question, but I think my interest in philosophy was developed over time, and I think maybe the first philosophical theory or idea that interested me was Immanuel Kant, because his ideas provided a very general overview of everything in life. And I found that by learning philosophy, I could nearly understand everything that could be understood. And learning philosophy has also allowed me to connect culturally with my family and friends, because philosophy is very much intertwined with culture and society, and lots of cultural practices and rituals are much rooted in philosophy.
That's definitely which is something I've found as well. It's like almost the more you think about philosophy, at least from a more continental approach, you do get that understanding of culture, that tradition, and the interactions with other people definitely gets enriched. Is that even a word? Enrich? No, that's not what it is. No, it just gets it is developed or becomes more fruitful when with that element of philosophy and that understanding of philosophy. Now you raised Kant. What was it? I suppose you talked a bit about how it's applicable to a lot of thinkers, a lot of ideas. What was it that drew you to Kant?
So I think I was reading another book about an introduction to philosophy, and I came across Friedrich Nietzsche, and I think he was actually the first philosopher I got into, because I thought there were many quotes of him online in popular culture as well, and his ideas were often misinterpreted. So I tried to find the correct interpretations of his ideas, and I found them very interesting. But then I kept reading the Introduction to Philosophy book, and there was a line which said that when Nietzsche declared that God is dead, while Nietzsche may have seen that God is dead, the real killer of God was Immanuel Kant. And so I tried to look more into Kant and look into his book, The Critique of Pure Reason, where he gave lots of counter arguments to traditional arguments for God. And I obviously found The Critique of Pure Reason a very challenging read with lots of new philosophical content and very interesting words and phrases that are specific to Kant. And so I would say maybe Kant was my first real challenge in philosophy, because all the earlier philosophy I've learned was really simple and explained in simple terms. So now that I actually encountered Kant, I found it as a sort of challenge that I needed to overcome. And after I overcame that challenge, it became very satisfying to finally understand his key ideas.
Yes. So I suppose you talked a bit about the death of God and Kant being the first killer of God, perhaps. I remember skimming through the first book that you published, I think, and it was something about God as a transcendent object. Do you think the killing of God was precisely that movement away from God as this personal interaction, being that people interact with perhaps a more kind of a historical Christian God to a God of the transcendent object? Do you think that is ultimately what was the killing of God that is perhaps being described, and also Kant's contribution to the discussion?
I would say Kant's contribution to the death of God was by reasoning that the concept of God is inconsistent with qualities of God like omnipotence or omniscience. And that reveals that you can't have a particular view on God because the qualities of God are established by different belief systems and the qualities themselves differ from one system to another. So maybe Kant's Death of God argues that it's better to have a more comprehensive idea of God that includes all religions, so very much a pluralist view of God. And that is sort of what I was trying to achieve in my first book about God as some transcendent entity that generalized all religions and all formulations of God, and in fact, everything that existed a priori or prior to experience, and collectively that thing is known as God.
If you've been enjoying this video so far and have found it helpful, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. If you want to support this channel financially and support our mission, then check out our Patreon in the link below where you can support our channel there as well. Hope you enjoyed this video and let's carry on. What do you think is the role of philosophy of religion and how does that tie into kind of broader philosophy? And do you think that that's a good place to start when you're thinking about philosophy as a whole? Do you think philosophy of religion is a good place to start, or perhaps there's other places which are better entry points into philosophy?
I'd say philosophy of religion is not really a good place to start because most people who are new to philosophy don't really have an interest in religion, because most people sort of assume philosophy and religion to be synonymous. And so when they dismiss philosophy as being old-fashioned and outdated, they also dismiss religion as being old-fashioned and outdated. So to really create interest in philosophy, you must first start with something else that isn't philosophy of religion, because that will just drive people further away from philosophy. So I'd say maybe philosophy of maybe existence. So maybe personal guides to how to live your life. So maybe existentialism or hedonism and nihilism, the different views on life in general, because that would be the most practically applicable.
I get where you're coming from. To what extent is philosophy viewed in the same lens as religion, and also to what extent are they tied together such that when one dismisses one inadvertently dismisses the other? I think that's definitely a very interesting thing that you pointed out. Now, perhaps to end off this interview, I'd like to ask you about your current projects and what you're working on, because I've always been very impressed by the fact that you're into philosophy, but I'm even more impressed by the fact that you actually do quite a lot of work on it on the side as well. Because a lot of times when I'm being high school students, and I was a high school student myself, like when you hear someone says, "Oh, I quite like psychology," and you ask them what you've done about psychology, they're like, "Oh, I watched one YouTube video on it, and I found that quite interesting." But you actually do quite a lot on the side, so perhaps you could tell the audience what you're doing on the side and discuss that.
Okay, so I think last week I recently finished writing a new book and published it by myself on Amazon, and it's called The Impossibility of Truth, a treatise on anti-logic. And so I originally conceived that project a year ago because I thought I wanted to get to the very fundamental questions of philosophy, and I wanted to see what was truly fundamental to the universe. And I ended up realizing that that was truth, or at least the concept of truth. And this is because in the opening of my book, I posed the question, does truth exist? And I said, if you respond with yes, then you're presupposing that yes has any meaning at all. And the meaning of yes is the affirmation of truth. So you're already presupposing that truth exists. And if you reply with no, then no is simply the negation of yes, which means that you're still assuming that truth exists in some way. And you can't really respond with the third option beyond yes or no, because that would just be denying those options and therefore saying it's false or not true, which would still be assuming that truth exists. So I realized that you can never really question the existence of truth, and therefore must truly be fundamental to the universe. But then if it's fundamental, does it really exist, or is it really possible? And I originally had the idea that it was probably not possible because I encountered a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche where he said, there are no facts, only interpretations, from his will to power.
Mm.
And so I started to look more into the subject, and I derived definitions of truth and impossibility. And so I ended up defining truth as that which cannot be defined. And I did that by arguing that perhaps the inability to understand truth, or how it is grounded in our understanding of the world, is the very definition of truth. And then I outlined 10 propositions about truth and its relation to other concepts. And I checked that that which cannot be defined aligns with those 10 propositions. And then I used the grammatical idea of alethic vs epistemic moods in grammar to show that subjective and objective truths ultimately mean the same thing. Because in language, if you say something subjective like he is hungry, vs if you say something objective like he is Asian, then the grammar and the syntax does not really change, which reveals that subjectivity and objectivity are ultimately the same thing. And then after other analyses of truth and its relation to other concepts, I proceeded to the concept of impossibility. And I sort of talked about impossibility and what it really meant. And after that, I considered two antinomies, which is a Kantian word for unresolvable paradoxes, which lie at the limits of human reason. And these antinomies arise when one considers the proposition truth is impossible. And the first antinomy I pointed out is, if truth is impossible, then is the proposition truth is impossible true? And I tried to resolve that proposition using many different methods. And in the end, I finally realized that the proposition truth is impossible exists in what I call a positive noumenal state. And this is based on Kant's distinction between the noumena and the phenomena, where the phenomena is the world of experience and noumena is that which transcends experience. But then Kant also had this other distinction that's less well known about positive noumena and negative noumena. And basically, negative noumena is that which transcends experience but can still be deduced through reason. And then positive noumena is that which transcends both experience and human reason. And so I say that the proposition truth is impossible is neither true nor false and is in a positive noumenal state. And the second antinomy I came across is, if truth is impossible, then I would be falsifying the existence of truth. But by falsifying the existence of something, then I would be saying that it's not true, therefore still assuming that truth exists in some way or another. And to resolve this antinomy, I had to develop this system of what I called anti-logic. And anti-logic is basically everything that logic is not. And I will talk more about anti-logic at the end because it's quite complex, and I only started to explore it more after I developed the arguments for why truth doesn't exist. And so by putting the antinomies before I began my argument that truth is impossible, I sort of made the reader clear any pre-held assumptions that they may have had about the validity of my argument. And so my argument for why truth is impossible is basically centered around a proof by cases method. And I argued that truth can either be empirical or rational, at least in relation to a human subject. And I argued that truth is only truth if a human knows about the truth, because truth is that which cannot be defined. And to define something, you need a human to define it, or at least a human to know of the definition or lack thereof. And so I first started by showing that empirical truths are impossible. And this is through several arguments. The first is about how information is always inconstant in the empirical world. So basically, I argue that the world is always changing, and nothing ever stays the same because there are, of course, different historical eras and the different ideas associated with them. For example, the transition from modernism into postmodernism and how that has influenced people's perspectives about the world and about how the world should become. And there are also other reasons for that. For example, there's like the scientific idea of entropy and decay happening in the physical order of the world. And so if everything is inconstant, then truth cannot exist because truth must be constant because that which cannot be defined concerns the possibility of definition. So if something's impossible, then it's always or constantly impossible. So truth must be a constant concept. And so if truth exists in an ever-changing, inconstant world, then truth cannot exist. And the second argument for why empirical truths are impossible is mainly about how the world can be conceived idealistically. So basically, everything you know about has to exist in your own mind. And that means everything is ultimately subjective, like I talked about earlier, about how there is no distinction between subjectivity and objectivity. And that basically means truth is always subjective, but truth must be objective based on its definition as that which cannot be defined, because that assumes an absolute impossibility of definition from all people and not just in relation to a single subject. And so, yeah, those are two of the arguments I use to show that empirical truths are impossible, and there are some others. And then I proceeded to why rational truths are impossible. And to show why rational truths are impossible, I considered how rational truth is impossible in the purely rational. So rational reasoning or rational ideas that are detached from the empirical world entirely. So for example, pure logic. And then I also considered the impossibility of truth in the synthesis of the empirical with the rational, and then also the impossibility of rational truth in art. And so first with the synthesis of the empirical with the rational, I already showed that empirical truths are impossible. So if you synthesize something that has the impossibility of being true with the rational, then that means by the law of transitivity, the whole synthesis is also impossible or has the impossibility of being true. And so it's quite simple. But it also has really serious implications because most reason revolves around some sort of empirical framework. So, for example, all science must not be true in the definition of truth assumed earlier. And then the impossibility of truth in the purely rational was harder to prove, but I basically used a very complex system of reasoning to show that truth essentially negates its own concept or results in its own self-contradiction, or showed that reason does have its limits and then reason contradicts itself. And I think this is best exemplified through Kant's ideas of the antinomy, which I talked about earlier about the limits of human reason. And then the impossibility of truth in art. So I argued that before the postmodern age, art was mainly an irrational force, and then it later became rational after the postmodern age. And before the postmodern age, the world of natural logic and reason was rational. But then after the postmodern age, the world became irrational and art became rational. So I argued that this was mainly due to how art before the postmodern age was more of a productive and creative force. And then after the postmodern age, art became much more mechanical. And I think Walter Benjamin talked about it in his book, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, where he argues that art has lost its uniqueness or aura after maybe the transition into modernity, and how art can no longer be authentic. And this is even heightened after the transition is into postmodernity, with how everything is dictated by societal systems and ideas, and that sort of makes art itself limited by social and political and economic factors. But then the world itself becomes irrational because, like I said earlier, information always changes in the postmodern world. And so if art becomes rational after the postmodern age, and I already showed that the purely rational has the impossibility of being true, then art cannot have truth either. And then after analyzing why truth is impossible, I proceeded to talk about this idea of anti-logic, which I touched upon earlier. And basically, logic is ultimately the determination of how true certain ideas are. So if in logic you would say there's a proposition, this pen is black, and then you need to figure out if that proposition is true or false. So logic is ultimately concerned with truth. And if truth is impossible, then that means logic is, in a sense, also impossible. And that means you have to proceed to a negation of logic, which is what I called anti-logic. And it's basically everything that logic is not. And it's quite hard to get your head around, because I argue that the human knowledge of the world is itself rooted in logic. So you can never truly understand anti-logic, because the human mind is not conditioned to understand that which is not logical. But I also argue that anti-logic must have qualities that are directly opposed to logical ideas. And a few examples of this are, first of all, the scope of the anti-logical system. So we all know that logical systems are finite, and they have a finite set of axioms and rules. But if anti-logic is the determinate negation of logic, that means anti-logic is unlimited and infinite and has no limits. And that means anti-logic is basically everything that can exist or has the possibility of existing. And so anti-logic is basically everything. And then I try to derive 6 principles of anti-logic. So the first principle is that self-reference is possible. It's because I'm referring to anti-logic itself using self-reference. And then the second is that contradiction is essential to anti-logic, because in logic, everything that is true is that which does not contradict. Which means that in anti-logic, everything that contradicts must be the equivalent of being true in logic. And yeah, I think that's basically all the important bits about anti-logic and how it fundamentally negates logic and is a better way of looking at the world, even though it cannot be fully comprehended. And then I applied these anti-logical ideas and principles to sociology and theology in the following 2 chapters. So with sociology, I talked about how an anti-logical ethical system would be one that is purely implicit and not directly spoken, because traditional ethics usually lay out some sort of rules or a set of moral principles. Like in utilitarianism, you have the greatest good for the greatest number. But then I think I based this on an idea from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, where he talked about the idea of the ethical life, which is basically how real morality is unspoken and lies hidden under society as a whole. So I think I drew upon this idea and argued that since logic makes it such that ethics must be explicit and direct in its expression of ideas, and anti-logical ethics will be implicit in that expression of ideas. So an anti-logical ethics would nearly be unknowable. And then I said that I proceeded to talk about anti-logical societies and how they would ideally follow this anti-logical ethics, and also how an anti-logical society would be one that does not really have a clear structure or order and is purely revolved around individual subjects and their own ideas. And then after that, I talked about an anti-logical theology. And I basically first used the theory of anti-logic to prove a pluralistic worldview and conception of God, and how even though all religions contradict one another, and since contradiction is fundamental to anti-logic, that means the contradiction between different belief systems is precisely what makes a pluralist worldview valid. And with this pluralist conception of God using anti-logic, I then tried showing that this God must exist. And I think that is how I ended the book.
That's definitely a lot to digest. Before we end off this video, I'd like to finally end off with asking you, what are your plans for the future? Because that's something which I've been very, very interested in. Are you planning to go down academia?
Well, I guess my future will probably involve philosophy because it's one of the things I'm best at. But I'm not sure. I think I'll start with academia, but I'm not sure if I'll continue with academia into my later life. And I think maybe it's better to not know what my plans for the future are, because I think Kant also said art is purposiveness without purpose. So you don't really have a clear purpose going into things, and you just sort of make it up as you go along. And that is certainly a very freeing way of thinking about the future.
And I suppose that ties into this final question I want to ask you, which is, well, all right, you're finding yourself thinking about, okay, I'm currently in high school, I'm looking at university. What are the stages, or what are the things that's going through your mind when you're thinking about, well, all right, I'm going to be doing philosophy, I have academia in mind, but I might not do that in the future. What are the things going on in your mind when you're thinking about university, your goals for the future, and beyond, perhaps, especially related to your kind of your high school life and its development to university?
Well, I don't really know too much about universities as of yet, so I don't have specific ones that I'm thinking of applying to in the future. But I think I'll try to just choose a university that will allow me to have a more thorough understanding of philosophy, or some other subject with philosophy that I can take, so I can learn multiple things at once. And I think I'll try to develop more philosophical ideas in the future to create my own worldview and to try and understand the world better, which can then allow me to live life better.
And I suppose you talk a lot about creation there. And of course you go back to the Ecclesiastes' idea of saying there's nothing new under the sun. And it's something I've been wrestling with a lot recently, is that on one hand, I'm thinking a lot about creation, or a lot about, I want to do something new, or create a new thought, or build your worldview. But at the same time, the more you think about that, the more you realize a lot of things have been done before, or at least have been talked about before. Where do you think the balance lies between trying to create a new worldview and or sticking to the past? And what do you think is the challenge of us as philosophers in the modern world trying to create or actually be philosophers when so much has already been written? Do you think that the realm of things which can be discussed is getting smaller, or do you think that given the development of society, although certain realms of philosophy might be getting smaller, there's still a lot of room for creation in regards to other certain fields of philosophy?
Well, I do think that philosophy is becoming a much smaller field, with more and more philosophical ideas being developed over time. And I think all philosophical ideas that you think are original are, in a way, just synthesized or new formulations of previous philosophical ideas. And I think lots of famous philosophers also often take ideas from other philosophers but rebrand them. So you have like Baudrillard, the postmodernist, and his concept of sign value, which is basically just a rebranding of Marx's idea of commodity fetishism. And I won't go too much into what they mean, but basically philosophers often take ideas from others, but then present them as original. But I also think there's a certain danger in just meaninglessly creating new things after new things. And it's sometimes better to stick to original ideas because some like 1 + 1 = 2 is an idea that is useful and doesn't need to be destroyed or questioned. But then the danger of philosophy is that you might want to question everything, or you might want to always endlessly create new ideas when old ideas are already pretty good. And so that means maybe rebranding old philosophical ideas as your own isn't too bad. And it also allows for those ideas themselves to be strengthened and popularized, which allows for a better understanding of the world as a whole.
I think that's a really beautiful analysis of the idea, and is a beautiful place to end off this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you enjoyed this discussion. Like always, stay safe, my friends. Make sure you like and subscribe to this video, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you next one.